most here know that I've lived most of my adult life with a writer and a writing community. So when I first heard about your thesis, someone who has also enjoyed writing and writers and exploring a life in architecture and in space, and the effort and the interest you had in asking some pretty deep and revealing questions about the relationship between the written word and the experienced space. I was drawn to it right away, and I enjoyed very much your probing of this, and like in the last thesis, some of the process that you go through to set the ground on which you're going to work creatively is important for us to pay attention to. So with that, I'll invite you to embark on this process and take us to Reykjavik.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I just want to take a moment and thank my committee, Professor Peter Noonan, Dean Conrad, Human Kaliji, and my chair, Garth Castle. Thank you for all your support. Also to my classmates for helping me get through all of this. That really means a lot to me. The title of my thesis is called Inhabiting the Memoir, Architecture Through Narrative Structure. I saw this thesis as an opportunity to test the disciplinary limits of writing and architecture, to see what might come from a design process inspired by narrative. I wanted to know how storytelling could intensify architecture. As Garth said, I came to architecture with a background in literature and a deep appreciation for storytelling. Every novel, play, film we know and love has a narrative structure. Sometimes those structures are designed by the storyteller, other times they happen on their own, but successful structures deliver compelling stories. What I want to convey to you is that narrative structures are powerful. They evoke emotional responses within us. They are the framework by which internalized experiences are externalized. In short, there is no storytelling without them. This thesis examines architecture through the lessons I have learned from the personal memoir. Memoirs are works of literary fiction or nonfiction written in the first-person perspective. They're not quite autobiographies, which present themselves as whole, factual, detached. They're not diaries. Rather, they are highly personal, reflective works that map an author's process of self-discovery. Memoir writing is a process of reassembly that takes fragments of memories and reconstitutes them into a collaged whole. I chose to investigate memoirs because I see them as vehicles for self-discovery and self-reflection in architecture. I believe that a cross-disciplinary approach to architecture can serve as a springboard for a more nuanced and adventurous approach to architectural design. So how did I do this? Well, I studied the works of 3 contemporary memoirs and 6 designers that I admire and whose stories and images continue to resonate with me. I performed a sort of reversed disciplinary examination of them. I created visuals inspired by the text and extrapolated narrative principles found in the bodies of work of these designers. This process was critical to my translation of memoir to architecture, and I think it's important to go through my conclusions. These designers I've selected all practice a design thinking methodology closely tied to memoir. They all deal with externalization of internal early in the design process and use various modes of representation. I looked at Massimo Scolari, whose myth-based body of work privileges the use of imagined narratives as a means of provoking architectural thinking and design. His work does not follow a linear methodology, but rather each investigation creates another body of work with new artifacts of interest. These paintings showcase, these paintings are from over the course of 30 years, and they showcase this motif of flying and floating objects. He reimagines them in new contexts, and they sort of come across as relics from another time and place. He challenges readings of space and time through representation. I also investigated John Haydick and his narrative-based projects known as the architectural masks. These masks are anthropomorphic structures with nomadic qualities not typically associated with architecture. Haydick's characters and their stories live within the drawn page, and like Scolari's work, they reappear, slightly altered in other places. There's a mystery to Haydick's designs that stems from their pre-existing life on the page in mind of the architect. Stephen Hall also uses narrative seeds in his design process that translate into his built work. You can see his building his body concept for the Nut Hampstead Center. Similar to Haydick's mass characters, Hall's work is animated and full of story. This is because of a design process inspired by ideas. I was inspired by Turani and his drawings of the Danteum, an unveiled project to honor the Italian poet Dante in his writings. Turani evokes an atmosphere of the text through these consciously ambiguous images. Turani's representation is important to me because it serves as a link between the space of the text, purgatory, or hell, purgatory, paradise, and the outside external world. I look to Algas for his image-driven architecture that promotes surreal experiences, and finally, Aldo Rossi for his interest in montaging perspectives, a process that delves into the unreliability of memory, experience, and time. These three writers and their memoirs are the seeds of my visual exploration and have guided me in the design of this thesis that you see before you. I want to briefly introduce their memoirs and the free play exercises, visual exercises that they inspired. Night is an account of Elie Wiesel's experience in the Holocaust. The memoir explores the author's closeness to death. The space of the memoir is liminal, or the condition of being at a threshold between life and death, between day and night. These models and collages are studies of those liminal spaces. Wild is a memoir about an introspective journey through nature. The visual exercise imagines the author's emotional and spiritual journey. The series of 3 paintings here reflect the linear progression of her journey, but acknowledge moments and experiences of the past. The collage of those 3 images tries to transform a linear reading into an experience of simultaneity. The last memoir is Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. It is about her experience in a mental institution. It explores feelings of isolation and living in an alternate reality. The space of the memoir is that of a parallel universe in which time is suspended. These visuals explore the idea of portals or perforations in a membrane into this altered universe.
Are these you?
Yes, these are mine. Yes. So just to summarize the ideas that I'm drawing from the memoirs, that I'll be exploring my architecture, looking at liminal spaces inspired by night, ideas of promenade inspired by wild, and concepts of time inspired by Girl Interrupted. So I allowed these ideas to guide me in the selection of a program and site. I ultimately tested my process in the design of a writer's retreat in Reykjavik, Iceland. So Iceland is an isolated country with a rich literary tradition rooted in Nordic mythology, medieval sagas, and folklore. Storytelling is integral to the country's cultural memoir and has been the means through which people have come together to share ideas and disperse knowledge. My area of focus lies in the heart of the capital city. This area is surrounded by important buildings. You can see the Parliament House, Reykjavik City Hall. There's a National Museum of Iceland and the University down to the south. I decided to focus on 3 sites within this context: the cemetery, the park, and the island. Each site has been mapped to one of the memoirs that I just explained to you. Programmatically, I decided to divide the writer's retreat amongst this site. So the resident studios are housed in the cemetery, the event space is located in the park, and the specialized library on the island in the lake. I'll begin with the cemetery, which once again is connected to night. The concept of boundary is important to the site and my exploration of liminal spaces. Physical boundaries mark the cemetery as a figure in the city. It is on a hill, it is surrounded by a stone wall, it is heavily forested. There is also an unseen and sensed boundary between the earthly and spiritual realms. Inherent in cemeteries is a narrative of life and death. The cemetery is full of story and artifacts, names, epithets, and offerings from the living, waiting to inspire writers. The resident studios occupy the edge of the cemetery. They straddle the stone wall so that the front of the studio, you can see it here, engages the street, while the back of the studio, back of the residence, opens up to the burials. The park is the most public of the three sites and encourages interaction among resident writers, visitors, and locals. The program for the park includes public saunas and a dining hall for the writers that can be transformed to host event spaces. The pavilion is located between a corridor of wild trees and a manicured grass with pristine views of the lake. And finally, the island is a temporal site that changes throughout the seasons. Surrounded by water, the island is a figural landform isolated from the city fabric. The lake acts as Reykjavik's mirror, reflecting the passing of day to night from the 21 hours of sunlight during the summer and to just 4 hours of sunlight during the winter. When the lake freezes, the water transforms into a surface of connection rather than separation. The island epitomizes Iceland's cultural memoir of coming together to share a story and returning home to pass on and conserve those stories. Locating a specialized library that features books on Icelandic history, medieval sagas, and folklore on an island in the middle of the city is meant to serve as a contemplative symbol for Reykjavik and the country. So I want to take you through my process, since this is primarily a process-based thesis, and show you how I arrived, how I got from the memoir to the design. I'll begin once again with night. You'll remember that these are models and collages that I made inspired by the book, by the idea of liminal spaces. Before I even knew what site and program I was working with, I had placed them in an imagined landscape, exploring, again, liminal conditions. They're on a hill, teetering on an edge. When I sited them in the cemetery, I didn't quite know where they were going to go. This drawing was kind of an abstract study about what it would be like to be amongst the trees or buried into the earth. To intensify the feeling of liminality, I chose to site the resident studios on that wall, which led me to these drawings here. And then the perspectives, I think, show it best. This is that bedroom that's sunk in below the earth that opens up to the cemetery. There's a feeling of heaviness in that space, and that's juxtaposed to the writing studio, which is lofted and kind of hovers over the street. It engages the public realm with views to the lake and to the tower. So while you're writing, you can see the city, the churches, and then the specialized library. Wild, once again, is about a promenade through nature. These were the drawings, the paintings that I made that talk about a spiritual journey. I took those paintings and turned them into perspectives. This, for instance, imagines a space under a canopy, or the author writes about sleeping in a tent under trees, under a veil so you're part of the outside but you're still protected. I was examining that feeling. Once again, when I decided to situate my building in the park alongside that brush corridor with wild trees, I transformed that idea to make it contextual and connected to the site. And I thought about having two edges to the building, a more weathered edge on this side, and then a more pristine edge on this side to the lake. The idea would be that there would be a promenade through the building that takes you from that weathered edge and takes you on that spiritual journey, and then you arrive on that pristine edge looking at the lake. So as you enter the building, you enter here, you ramp down, and these are the saunas. So programmatically, you descend and you approach the public saunas, which are supposed to be a moment of purification. When you leave the saunas, you're under a bosque of trees. It's a little bit more organized, but still open to the light. And you can make your way back up a ramp to this patio and into the event space with views of the lake. You can see it here in the perspectives, that moment going down the ramp, the weathered edge, the beams are coming out in a weathered fashion, and you see the trees, you see the sauna at the end of your site, So you can see once again, leaving the sauna under that boss of trees, and then finally arriving into this grand space, a clean edge, seeing the tower, but still being able to see where you came from. That was the idea behind this building. And finally, Storm erupted. Once again, it's about time and being in an alternate reality. These paintings explored the idea of a portal into that other world. Because of the site restrictions of that island, it's only 50 feet in its diameter. I knew I was going to be making a tower. This collage explores kind of the form of the building in different seasons. What it would be like to be able to walk up to it, how it would be to access it by boat, and to intensify the idea of being in another world and just using a sense of time. I designed it so that all of the openings occur in the form of skylights or punch openings that that guide your view down to the water. So you only see the light or you only see the water. You are not going to the city. You don't know where the city hall is. You're not meant to. And when you arrive to the top, it opens up for views of the northern lights. These images, this shows that light coming up, sort of like a lantern in the middle of the lake. And then this perspective shows the light flooding the wall coming from an unknown spot. So, what did I learn? I learned a lot during this thesis, but I think the most important thing I learned is that this process was very important. These drawings for me have been the link between text and architecture, between idea and thing. And what I realized is that imagination and memory are not precise, and architecture has to be. And that there's value in producing these types of drawings that have a little bit of imagination, a little bit of reality. It's important to carry that on, to produce these drawings that are imbued with story in the creation of architecture, because I believe that doing so creates more profound, meaningful architecture and more profound experiences. Would up to any questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Sure.
I think if we, for a moment, took away the writers and the architects that inspired the work and looked at the project, I feel that in many ways it would be an extremely powerful project without the backstory, even though I would agree with you completely that the process was what created the architecture. But now that you've made it, what is the narrative behind your work? Behind this particular project and these particular writers, this particular program in this site? What is the narrative if you were to retroactively
come back and
assign a narrative?
That's a good point. And we were talking about writing a story for this place, which would be really interesting to do. And I think, I'm not sure yet. I think I've designed the buildings separately, kind of, and the narrative would have to come from how they all come together and create the campus, I think, and the experience of a writer. The section, you see them all together, but...
That's the narrative right there, I think.
Okay.
Andrea, let me...
You just one minute though.
Okay.
I'll take that. What is the narrative of the site, of the way that you cited the trilogy? Mm-hmm. You started out with 3 books, there are 3 narratives, and you've now said, okay, each one has a counterpoint, but that you've chosen to separate them, and there's a very, very unique topographical, urban, landscape site that you place these things in. So what is your...
So you're saying there's potentially a new narrative now that we've all been
something informed that narrative.
Yeah. I think the process was mostly intuitive, so I've had a hard time pulling out how I've made my decision-making process.
I think you should stop there, because
Okay.
I think you articulated almost exactly what was going through my mind, really, even before we got... First of all, I want to say this is an extremely beautiful presentation, and I think artistry with which you have composed these forms. I mean, I think the invention of these and compositions. This is an extraordinary drawing. They all are fabulous. So I want to just put right on the table that I think it's a beautiful piece of work. You made it clear at some point about using this as a way of exploring process and getting to these. And I think your point is, of course, valid. I mean, we could give this we could take exactly the same narrative research and hand it to 6 architects, and we would get 6 completely different solutions. And I think I think architects have always found inspiration for compositions, for designs that may ultimately have very little to do with the sort of Vitruvian idea of what architecture is about. I have no problem accepting the notion that you began with something and a lot of this was intuitive. I'm really glad you said that word, because I think intuition is something that we do. It's why it differentiates us from engineers. If we didn't use our intuition, we wouldn't have any work to do. So I would compliment you on that. At first I thought you were pursuing sort of architecture parlante, the French term, speaking architecture that actually does deliver a story, or that tells by intrinsically what it's about. And ultimately, I don't think that has happened here. I mean, I think what you've done is gone through a process, as you've said, that inspired you to come up with these forms, with these visual and experiential ideas. I mean, we could talk a lot about, and I agree about the site question. I mean, I think when I first saw this, I thought, oh, this is interesting. She's sort of taking control. She's using these elements to actually make a great space, none of which you own, but you're putting these elements around it so that you are taking control of it. The only thing that I would question is, I'm not sure, and I do spend a lot of my time writing, by the way. I'm not sure I understand why you felt that the workspaces themselves needed to be at the edge of the cemetery. I mean, it seems to me that the notion of putting something on the edge is a valid notion. I would have bought, if you had said to me, I want to sort of do the La Villette thing. I'm going to put a bunch of follies, or I'm going to put a bunch of elements there, because I think to sort of do that, to make that gesture, to make that lasso that lake, that's an appropriate thing. But I don't think they even needed to have any purpose. I mean, it might have just been some icons. And the place that I work might not have been at the edge of a cemetery. I mean, that was the one mystery to me. This notion of the liminal, the night as the logical place to write. Other than that, I think the artistry with which this has been executed is really spectacular.
Have you worked this way before?
I think, yeah, I never get to carry it out too far, and so this is the first time that I could do a whole project. It was always hard to figure out what to do next, so I got the time to do that this time.
Wow, that's a good choice.
Icelandic people are fiercely independent, and of course the famous saga, Independent People, is an incredible story of just that, how each Icelandic person is an individual. They really don't ever agree on anything, and yet they always help each other out. They always collect to help each other out in the face of this extreme environment. And I love your little, 54% of Iceland believe in elves. It's very true. Yeah. The temperature never gets hotter than, 52?
Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure, I don't have that great eyesight from a distance, but with a little wedge, is that there's...
1 in 10 publish a book.
Publish a book. And 99.9% of Icelanders can trace their heritage to somebody from the very first Viking that set foot on this, island. There's a place called Thingvellir. Did you go to it outside of the town, which is where the kind of parliament, the sort of summer parliament that all the Icelandic Vikings would congregate once a year and come from all over Iceland to,
Yes.
and all the
The Althing
laws,
Assembly.
the Althing, and
Yeah.
all the laws were established there, and it really very much used and participated in the landscape as sort of platforms for creating space, collective space, individual space. So they would always go back to their sort of precincts and then argue and discuss, and then come back and representatives would together create the laws. Crimes would be punished then. It was a really, so the site that you've chosen, the reason why I go into it is I do want to say, I'm not dismissing it at all. I think, you have an incredible facility for representing atmosphere, and I think that is extremely powerful part of the project. And I think your interpretations and your clarity may be part retroactive, I suspect your process was not that linear, but I think you really constructed your presentation in a very, very convincing fashion. I have to say I argue with your selection of site and context. I think, so going back to that notion of fiercely independent, you've created a kind of complex of buildings that are related to each other in a kind of in a very comprehensive way, where I think even the town hall right to the north, the city hall, is intentionally a kind of byproduct of a series of traces of circulations. On one hand, it's a gateway to the ice skaters as they come off that winter lake. It's a bridge that extends from the east across through the town hall to create a kind of a forum for that the hall is there for the people. On the north side is the lake that's brought to the north side to create a kind of foreground for the room in which all decisions are made. So it's a building, but it's a city in and of itself. And I think by distributing your program on several different sites, I think it's fantastic. But I'm not sure about the collective kind of message. Are they really taking over that large amount of real estate? Yeah. Whereas, maybe, and even if one could suggest that, writing is a very collective affair, it would seem that to think about the individual, I would have peppered them throughout the entire city if you wanted to make, I don't know why it's in an urban context to begin with. There are these fantastic military installations, to the northwest, right on the edge, if you went to visit them when you were there, that are beautiful construction, military outposts that were constructed there in World War II. But what they do ultimately, which is why I think maybe your sauna building, I guess I'll call it, is probably the clearest building. They really frame the landscape, they frame the horizon. And in Iceland, in Reykjavik, you're always about the horizon. Like, how do you measure this sort of infinite landscape, where the sun often does not set, and measure it. And so I really appreciate that aspect of the project, that you have this sort of horizontal plane, where is that image here? Sort of Barcelona, German pavilion, but the kind of horizontal plane that really kind of measures the relationship of the landscape in the background of the Reykjavik, but also creating a space that's sort of, for just a moment occupying that landscape, but it's never really fixed. And I really appreciate the above, within, and below the Stephen Hall kind of thing about the high line, occupying above the wall or within the wall or below. I too question the relationship to the cemetery, because ultimately there's many cultures where the people are buried. These are not sarcophagus. What are they? The building, the family sanctuaries where you bury people. You go into the mausoleums. Thank you. So that metaphor is probably a little maybe too strong. And then the build, and then the one on the lake. I mean, again, it's such a heroic, building. Inaccessible probably during the summer. By boat. Yeah. But for to colonize that as a kind of private building, I think is a little bit is a bit much. I really feel like that is such a public place. So the notion that belongs to a writer's colony that is very exclusive to the colony, maybe that's not your intention. Maybe it's open to everyone, but it seems.
It's a specialized library.
It's not part of the colony.
I imagine that it could be associated with the university, and that it's.
Yeah, no, I suspect it's, well, again, I was assuming maybe I'm stand corrected that it was part of your initiative of the sort of writers,
Sure.
these visitors that come,
But
but
the building of the park is also partly open to the public, the saunas are open to the public and the writers, so I wanted to, back to your earlier point about citing it in the city, I wanted to have those happenstance encounters, the writers and people, because, I think a lot of ideas can be generated from those interactions.
no, I would agree. Did you go up to Stickisholmer and see Ronnie Horn's Library of Water? It's incredible. It's in literally the old library, and now so it's a very public building, a very small building though, very sort of, which actually takes the entire context of the Stickishomers and brings it in as a series of reflections that are stored, within these columns of water, all the glaciers that are all over Iceland that are now no longer going to be there. So it's a kind of inventory and archive of water of the glaciers. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling a bit, but I do want to say, no one seems to be grabbing this. Am I
Well, I just wanted to pick up, so I was actually thinking that the liminal space for the residence hall was actually the best place for it, and it's exactly where I would want to work, I think that it could, you're on the edge of death, and you're separated between a dark place and a light place, and every day, multiple times, you're forced to look at something from a completely opposite perspective. That's the essence of the creative process. How can I turn that glass over and approach this a different way every time? So I really like that. I hope that that's what I'm reading in that. Those are the things I'd be seeing. And it's stressful. And that also is the essence of the creative process. So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really captivated by thinking about these questions. And I would agree about the space for the writing process, because I think that the writers are there in the land of living, yet they're creating something that's going to live on after they pass, into the cemetery. So I like that kind of tenuous space between life and death. I'm wondering, though, about the promenade. Cheryl Strayed's book was really a very long journey, and I'm not sure that. I guess I want to ask the question if you had at any point considered making the promenade a connection between the writer's space and the library, because the writer's products will take that journey, ultimately to go, to become part of a library, kind of like experience of literature. And I just, even though I see a journey in that building, I'm not sure I see quite a long enough journey. What I got from Wilde was that, long, hard experience of landscapes that challenged her very being, and that personal transformation and redemption through engaging with the landscape. And it just seems to me that what I'm searching for in your work is the route from where the writer is living and working to the library. And I would just love to see that route amplified somehow by a kind of larger promenade through this really fantastic landscape. Make it swim.
Yeah,
Swim in the library, that would be a more arduous way. Yeah, and I really do, agree with that fast comment that everybody made at the beginning, that section is your narrative. But I also would have loved to see you close that loop, to take your writerly, talents that you've explored. Well, you've done such a beautiful job of translating your essence as a writer into these visual texts, and it would have been very lovely to see you then, compose a literary text,
Yes.
Based on your experience of drawing.
Just one quick thought, I think maybe that's actually what, the fact that Madeline pulled out of the book, that this journey as being, extensive. I haven't read that book, I've read Night, and you pulled something else out, maybe that's also part of the point. I think I read Night when I was in 7th grade, and I still have an image of walking with his father, and I think I don't remember his father died, I just remember that image. And so maybe part of what you're sharing with us is that we each maybe take out different pieces from these books, and that becomes the generator for each of us a little differently.
I'm wondering if the response to what is your narrative ought to be turned right back around by you to the audience and to say, well, this is my narrative, it's visual, it's there. How do you interpret it?
Great suggestion.
It's no James Sterling.
I just want to thank you. I think this is as we've all said, it's really it's beautifully presented. It's evocative. It's provocative. It really gets you thinking. The thing that I think is interesting, maybe for all of us, is how narrative can inspire the creative process and the journey and the development of architecture. When you get out of school and you really start doing this every day for a living, you could argue it can turn into a little bit of a long slog, but going back and recharging your own battery, filling your own gas tank, and having the energy to go from here to there, and here to there might be a couple months in a process, or it might be a couple years, depending on what kind of project you're working on. Finding ways to inspire yourself is I think another thing that you've explored here that I hope everybody takes away from this, because it's really important. And whether it's something you've read that then inspires a section, or the massing, or just the whole idea, I think it's something that's really important for everyone here in school to think about, because you're going to run into it. You're going to have times when you're running on fumes, and if you can go back and read a passage or be inspired by a book, or paint, stop what you're doing, stop drawing, go over there and paint or draw, and then come back to this. I think that's a very important part of our journey as architects, is being able to continually inspire ourselves by finding things in our environment, whether it's narrative or whatever. So thank you for kind of sharing that with everybody, because I think that's a pretty important part of the process and the story for all of us as architects.
I want to know how you got the northern lights into this. I'm far enough away from it. Yeah, how did you get the northern light? I'm just really curious about that beautiful drawing down there on the right.
There's an app for that.
There's an app for that? Yeah, it's very effective. It's very effective. I've been to Iceland, but I've never seen them there. I've only seen them in Russia. It's beautiful. Brian, I'm sort of tempted to try and answer your question, the interpretation. What?
Go ahead, keep going.
No, just Brian's question, because one of the things that if you stick around long enough, you realize that people do come with their own lenses and look at things and interpret them through eyes that are different from the designers. And I think that's not only likely to happen, I think it's desirable that people interpret things over time. I don't know, Brian, I have no answer. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to sort of accept this as on her terms. But tomorrow morning I may well have a response to the question. Your question.
I think if there's one thing that could help me to better understand, or to try to get into her head and understand her narrative, would be to have those initial, incredibly compelling, sequential sketches that were illustrations, the sort of first illustrations of the pieces of literature you read, to have them have more equal presence on this wall with the product, and to see that weave through more clearly. They've been marginalized extraordinarily. I mean, I can't, I was sitting over here kind of going, they're not there, and then all of a sudden I realized they're just so tiny. And so get rid of that little space there, expand, make those bigger, and make them be much more of a kind of sweep across the wall, and that may be a little easier to follow. I do have a little bit of difficulty. Unlike, I think it was the first project where we were talking about looking at something from the inside out. I have a little bit more difficulty in each of these trying to imagine what these things look like from the outside in. One of them is particularly object-like, and even though there are these kind of studies, particularly the island piece, right, it's still hard for me to get an image of what it is, what
See
it's...
this little guy over here?
No, it's what its materiality is, how it reflects light, how it works against the darkness and so forth. So I think, this section starts to get at it, but it makes me excited about wanting to know more about the exterior of these things.
I just want to try one more time to be a bit more articulate about that island. What is it about? I mean, this is such a unique context, and I'm trying to locate what things are vertical in Iceland, right? So the one thing that is very predominantly vertical are lighthouses that exist throughout because of the relationship to the water. So on one hand, it's a kind of uber lighthouse that kind of sits within a collection. So it's not just a library on an island in downtown Reykjavik, but it really, I think, needs to contextualize itself and locate itself within a tradition that's outside of itself. I think that's what I'm getting at. At the opposite end, it's a cairn. It's a kind of pile of rocks that through which the people find their way through the landscape. And this is a kind of uber cairn that is part that somehow brings us to Reykjavik. Or it's a representative of an iconic, a church or a steeple. So right now it is so ostentatious. Or I like to give the fountain in the foreground, right? Because we see it as a little fountain. But I think so its exuberance to me, I think, requires that there be a much more significant kind of communal cultural structure, which I think a library is, but it's such a small, it's a private library right now, the scale of it, I think. But I think it needs to sort of announce itself, it locates itself within the city, and in that sense I think it's sort of an interesting sighting of it, but it belongs as much to the town hall as it does to the to the saunas or to the writers, So I think, just to kind of go back a little bit, I feel you said let it slip at some point that you design these things outside of their context, or at least the first series, and then you looked for a place to cite them?
Well,
Is that
these
fair?
initial studies were just furthering the ideas. I didn't know I was going to be Iceland yet. So it was just
Because I think
probing.
the condition in Iceland is so powerful, the light, the weather, the beliefs, the sagas, that I wonder, had you begun with the site in addition to the sort of, as the third category, I wonder where it would have ended up.
Yeah, and that's what this long section was supposed to relate to the unique qualities of Iceland. It's supposed to show change in season, so the fall, in the cemetery, things changing and dying, and then moving to summer in the park, and then when you get to the tower, it's split between spring, when you have to take a boat to the library, and then winter, you can walk to it. It's that temporal site.
That's very, very well done.
Another question about your process.
Sure.
Did you write as you do?
I
Is
did.
there a parallel journal, text, memoir of your own that went with this, that you're...
I have a lot of process work where, when I was stuck, I started writing descriptions and stories about the island, the tower, to help me decide what it would look like, things like that. So I have that as part of the process as well.
So I'll give the last word to Garth, last word. But I just want to thank you for bringing this to the school, and I was really excited about this project, even at Thesis Match, and so I was glad to be on the committee. And I will let you think long and hard about that answer that you didn't give, but I would like to speculate about what the narrative of the project is, and I think it's a culmination of where you are right now. You brought your undergraduate interest in writing and married it with an architectural interest and the travels you've done here at the school, and just brought a really wonderful project to the community. So thank you.
Well, there's so many things I could say, but I did want to say that this has been an extraordinary conversation and a series of insights, most of which dance about a wondering that is about your wandering, that is, it's difficult to really pin down and to put into words, which I think is its strength. Melanie said something about working as an architect and the challenges of knowing that most all of our work is sponsored. It's driven by agendas and clients, and that the best talents that I've experienced in professional dealings, that is, best colleagues, have the ability to do what you are doing in this thesis, which is to unearth ideas and to bring them to the table in an open and, frankly, humble way. Most of the semester I've challenged you about your shyness. But I think what I see now in the shyness is a kind of quiet power that you let out through the work rather than through the assertion about the work. And I would say don't lose that. That's an extraordinary thing. I think what's fascinating is if you go back to the seminal work that you harvested and then bring it into harboring and being embodied in program, the origins in some ways are stronger than the work at the end. And I think the tower is one of the illustrations of that, the exuberance of the tower and its ability to stand as both a steeple and an ephemeral fountain is really quite extraordinary. The other only time that I've been in a climate like this, I think Andre knows, and I've spent only a few days in Iceland, but I studied for 6 months in Norway at a very seminal point in my formative point in my career, and very similar to your own. And I went from January to June, and I went from right to left in your section, because it was dark in Mr. Ace, and I thought, who in their right mind would live in this godforsaken place in the world? Yes, people were nice, and it was interesting. It was my first time abroad. But as the spring unfurled, I felt very much like this left end of your section, where I wanted darkness. I wanted to be sheltered from the darkness and the ubiquitous illumination. So I too would like to write in the cemetery. I too would like the choice to go in the dark zone or in the light zone. And I think you've just, you've convinced me after the course of the semester that you do have resource, and it's genuine, authentic, and deep. And although, you're inclined to shyness, it's probably what's feeding what's inside of you, and I would encourage you not to lose that.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.